In this video, we're going to combine NextAuth middleware with internationalization middleware to actually see them chain together or run one after the other. If you've seen on the channel a couple of weeks ago, I put out a video where you could chain middlewares together by producing this or creating this middleware factory functions that are functions that take in a middleware, do some stuff, and then return a middleware. And then we were able to kind of chain them in a function called chain, which is basically recursively calling itself until it goes through all the middlewares one by one, passing the stack or going down the stack, and then finally returns the response back to our pages. Now, if you're not familiar with what middlewares are, I do have a dedicated video on the channel where I explain what NextJs middlewares are from a high level. They're just functions that intercept the request or run code before the request is completed for things like authentication, like internationalization, or like A/B testing and whatnot, before you actually send the response back to the user. Now, prior to NextJs 12, I think you were able to have middleware functions per route. So in different segments of your application, you could have multiple middlewares. But now that's not the case. You can only now run one middleware file, one middleware function, and you have to place it in the root of your application. So inside the app router, or even in the NextJS, I think versions after 12.2 or something, you no longer can have multiple middlewares. It's just one middleware. Now, the problem is when you have one middleware file or function that you can run, well, if you're running multiple logic that is running on the edge or running using the middleware function, what would you do? Well, one way is to just combine everything in that one function and run, the logic one after the other. The other way is to kind of be able to separate the logic or the concern of these different tasks or functions into separate files and then run them one after the other. If you're coming from a Node.js or Express background, just like how we have different routes and middlewares that you can stack them on top of each other to run different logic and then pass the response back. The chain function had this idea of being able to run different files or create different functions for our middlewares and then stack them up one after the other. So if you haven't seen that video, you can go ahead and watch that video. After I have put that video out, people asked me to actually show an example of doing this in an application. In that video, I showed the concept. I introduced the chain function and then what middleware factory functions are, functions that take in a middleware, execute some code, and then return a middleware. But the middlewares we were using there was just logging stuff instead of doing anything. So in this example, I'm going to actually implement authentication using NextAuth in our app using the middleware, and we're going to also implement internationalization using, again, middleware. And then we're going to combine these two, or we're going to write two different middleware functions and then chain them together to run one after the other. So this is just a demo of what we're going to be creating. So we have a home page and we have a dashboard page, which is our protected page. We then have two languages, English, and then Deutsch for German. So you can sign in here. For now, I only have Google Social Login Provider. I have a dedicated video on the channel for NextAuth and protecting your NextJS application in the app router using NextAuth. So I'm going to link all of these videos that I mentioned throughout this tutorial in the cart or down in the description, so you can just go back and watch each individual video which is going to dive deeper into that subject. Here I'm just going to gloss over some of the concepts. So if you feel like you're confused or you don't know what's going on, go back to those videos to learn individually what we're doing. It's the same thing for internationalization. We do have a video on the channel where we're implementing internationalization in NextJS 13 in the app router. It is the same thing for NextJS 14. By the way, NextJS 14 was released. Nothing has changed in the 14. I had a video a couple of days ago actually introducing or explaining what has changed in NextJS 14, which is basically server actions are now stable, so no new APIs for you to learn or no changes. So anytime in the videos, if I say Next.js 13 by mistake instead of Next.js 14, just know that you can use them interchangeably because nothing has changed. So I just logged in here and I'm showing my the user's name over here. You can go to the dashboard. This was a protected route. And now you can just change the language to see the German version of that same page, or go back to the home page. You can also log out. I hope the translations that I have here are correct for anybody from Germany. I love the German language, but these are from Google Translate, so I apologize if they don't make sense. But nonetheless, if I now try to go to the dashboard, I just signed out to just see I'm now signed out. There is no user. So if I go to the dashboard without being signed in, because it's a protected page, the middleware runs. It realizes that we're not logged in, so it redirects us back to the sign-in page. This is the built-in sign-in page that comes from NextAuth. So we're going to log in. It is going to redirect us back to the dashboard page. It's the same thing if the language was German too. So this is what we're going to build together. So there's a lot to cover. Let's just dive right in. Okay, so if we're going to continue where we left off in the previous video, I'm going to include a link to the project source code on GitHub in the description. So it's called Next Middleware Chain. This is what we created in the previous video where we introduced this idea of having this chain function. And just as a review, we had this chain function, which is going to call this middleware factory functions one after the other to go through them all, and then the middlewares where these files where we have this wrapper factory functions that take in a middleware, do some logic, and then return another middleware. Now, one thing that I have added to that video, you might see it in the code, but it's not actually in the explanation of the videos. It's that in the first middleware, as you can see here, I'm creating an instance of our response to also be passed down to our middleware. This was mentioned by someone from the community because some of these middlewares might actually manipulate the response. They might set headers or cookies, and if you're not passing the same response object, you lose track of what these middlewares are doing along the way. So I have updated the code to reflect this, but you might not find this in the video. So this response is actually passed into this custom middleware functions down the path. So if any of these middlewares are actually setting anything on the response, you'd be able to see it here. So if you're going to build on top of it, again, the link is in the description, and there's 3 different branches for this. So the main branch is where we left off in that video. The example branch is where we're actually creating an example for NextAuth and internationalization together. But I'm going to show you 2 different ways to see how that's done. It's the same concept, but implemented in different ways. So let's get started here. From a high level, this is a Next.js application running TypeScript, Tailwind CSS, and some prettier options. The first step for us is to implement NextAuth. So going to the NextAuth package, we're going to have to install NextAuth. I've already done that. So if you're coding along with me, you can just go ahead and install the NextAuth. And then the second step is for us to actually create our API route. So if you look at the docs, you can see that since Next.js 13.2, instead of having API routes as we had in the pages directory, there's this guide that you can read, which tells you how to create your route handlers inside the app router to initialize your NextAuth config. So inside of the app, you're going to have to create an API folder just to keep the same convention that we had in the pages directory. For the app router, you don't actually have to put in your route handlers inside the API folder as you did in the pages directory, but just to keep the same kind of convention, as I mentioned, we can do that. Inside of auth, I'm going to have another folder. This is my catch all route for NextAuth, where I'm going to actually put in a route.ts file, and I'm going to copy some code, and I'm going to explain what we're doing here. But before I get there, let's actually create another route. Let's say hello, and then inside of the hello, I'm going to create another route.ts file where I can just export a get function. So let's actually explain what these are. Now, this is where you're going to initialize your NextAuth or the configuration for your NextAuth. we have this auth options object exported from this file because we need to use it actually anytime that we're calling or wanting to check the session on the server side. We're going to see that in a second. And basically, you're exporting get and post handlers from this route. This is the new convention in the app router. To turn a route into an endpoint, you would have to export named functions that map to HTTP methods. For example, for this /hello, we have the get function, which is just going to return this JSON object. Okay. So similar here, we have one provider, a Google provider. So you'd have to create an account on Google to create credentials and bring in your credentials here. You can pass them to your .env.local. I've included this .env.example here so you know what you need to set. This is your client ID and client secret for Google. You also have to pass in the NextAuth secret. This is going to be used to actually sign your tokens, and also the next URL, which in our development case would be http /localhost at port 3000, and then for your secret just use a randomly generated secret that will be used to sign your tokens, and then get your client ID and client secret from Google so that your NextAuth can actually use this provider. And that's all we need to do for this step. Now, going back to the previous page, our next step would be to actually pass in the session provider so we can actually access the session on the client side if you wanted to. So let's just do that. So I'm going to go to my app router. Inside of here, I'm going to create a file called providers.tsx. I'm going to just paste in a client component here. Again, this is a pattern that you would see actually providing providers or context providers inside the app router. We're going to export our own client component using this use client directive. We're going to get the session provider in this case, or theme provider and whatnot, from the package that we are using. And this component is just a component that wraps its children. So whatever children pass to it is going to be wrapped inside of the session provider, which means all of our components now have access to this session. Now, a common question that I get often when we actually use this pattern for providers, because we're going to bring this providers actually and wrap our pages inside of our root layout with this provider. So let me just bring in the provider. So a common question that I often get is that now that you are wrapping your root layout, or basically all the layouts and child pages, your server component inside of this providers, which was actually a client component, does this turn the whole application into a client component? The answer is no. You can pass server components as children or as props to client components without crossing the server client boundary. If you import a server component into a client component, or where you have defined this directive, it would turn into a client component, or it would just error out because you're now bringing a module from server and crossing over to the boundary of client. But you can pass them as children, which is, you can imagine, or you can think of it this way, that your client component runs and then there's spots or holes or slots available for server components to be plugged inside of it. And the server components are going to run on the server, and the result of it, the HTML, is going to be plugged inside these areas. So just a side note, but a common question that I often see comes up. So we have the providers. We wrapped our pages with the providers. Now any client component has access to this session as well. Next step would be to actually add the middleware. So let's go back to the NextAuth documentation. If you go to config for Next.js, there's a section that they actually talk about adding middleware. Now this allows you to actually authenticate the users before they access the page, so it's faster, but there is a limitation, and the limitation is, for now, you can only use the JWT or the JWT token session strategy. A little backstory: there's two different strategies you could use for your authentication. One is a session or the database session strategy. The other one is JSON Web Tokens. Now, in the session strategy, you would need a database, and then you would persist not only the user data, but the session information in the database, and then you would read from your database to actually authenticate the users. This is the traditional way of authentication. But the JSON web token doesn't need the database. You're just basically storing the user information in a signed token and then verifying that token to decide whether or not the user is authenticated. Now, why does this matter? Well, middlewares run on the edge. So on the edge, because the runtime is not a fully featured node runtime, you can't establish connections to databases or to all databases. Some databases have come up with ways that you can actually access your data through HTTP versus the TCP connection, that the traditional way of connecting to databases. But if your specific database doesn't actually support the edge environment, you'd have to change into a JSON web token strategy. Now you can still use a database to persist user data, but you have to explicitly, by passing an adapter, you can persist the user data in the database, but you can explicitly set the database strategy to JWT or JSON web tokens, so it can run on the middleware and it can run on the edge. So this is the limitation. If again you're not comfortable with what I'm saying, there's videos on the channel where I talk about NextAuth specifically and I explain in more details and actually implement them in action so you get to understand better. This is assuming that you've already seen those content or you're comfortable with what I'm talking about. It's just that if we want to now combine these two middlewares together. Nonetheless, if we come down, there's two ways that you can actually run this middleware. The first, or the basic use, is to just export this middleware that comes from NextAuth from your middleware.js or TS file. Okay, so let's just copy this one. If I go to my middleware, let me just close all the files. Let's go to our middleware. And right now, our middleware is just running that chain function from the previous example. So I'm just going to get rid of all of that. And instead, I'm just exporting this default function from NextAuth middleware. And this config matcher just tells Next.js for what paths in your application this middleware should run. If you don't pass in anything, so if you comment this out, this middleware would run on all of the routes, homepage, about page, whatever, dashboard page. But because this is for authentication, we're assuming or we're pretending that only our dashboard page is protected. So I only want this to run on the dashboard. Okay, so if I now save and go back to our application, we should have authentication in place. Well, we're not signed in, so let's do something that we can actually sign in and see if you're authenticated or not. So let's go to the page and replace this with another component. Okay, so let me explain what I'm doing here. This is the home page component. So again, inside of our page.tsx in the outermost app, this is responsible for rendering our home page. I turned it into an async function, which you can do for server components. I'm using the getServerSession function from NextAuth. You have to pass in your auth options. This is the same auth options we used in our catch-all API route to initialize NextAuth. This is going to give me the current session back, and from it, I'm just extracting the user to show the user information. I've created this auth button. What this auth button does is to just render two different buttons. One of them, if you're logged in, is going to call the sign out function from NextAuth. And if you're not logged in or signed in, it's going to call the sign in method. Now this auth we're going to actually implement this later on when we are bringing or adding internationalization. So instead of just showing this sign in and sign out as string text, we want to access our dictionary object and dynamically render that. So for now, I'm just going to get that out of the way. So let's just go, and this should work. So let's refresh. Okay, so right now we're signed in because I have signed in on the local host. In the beginning of the video, I'm still signed in, as you can see. So our authentication is working, and if I now sign out, I'll still be on the same page, but you see there's no user object, and then the button changes to say sign in. So our authentication is working just using this middleware function that we exported from the NextAuth. It comes in, we just put it right inside of our middleware function. There's no chaining happening, it's just one middleware adding authentication. Now in the next step, we're going to add internationalization. And for that, if you've watched the previous video, we implemented that using another middleware. So we need another middleware to actually redirect users to the correct locale when they're actually interacting with our site, or when they select different locales. So let's implement that together. We're going to change this middleware to actually allow us to run the internationalization. And once that's done, we're going to then combine them together. Now, the first step is to install two packages that we're going to be using to actually run or implement our internationalization. So I'm going to stop the dev server and pm The first package is this format.js Intel local matcher, and I'm going to explain where and how we're going to use this. And then the second package is called negotiator. This is going to actually detect what the preferred language or locale of the user is, depending on the accept header on the response that comes from the browser. So let's just restart the dev server over here. Now, if you have watched the video for the I18N where we are implementing internationalization, the idea is that we're going to move all of the routes inside of our app directory into a lang or locale dynamic folder. So we can detect that and pass it to our page component as the params object or inside the params object. And then we're going to define local dictionaries that are mapping different scopes, for example, different pages and different elements on the page, and then provide the different strings or translations for different languages, and then use these dictionaries on the server side, detecting that parameter or the lang parameter to actually show the correct string. Again, if you're not comfortable with this, watch that video where I step by step actually explain the idea of what we're doing and then actually also implement it in the code. So let's go inside of our app and create this dynamic lang folder. And then we're going to move everything other than the API folder actually inside of this lang folder. So let's just move them there. Sorry, mistypo here. That's lang. Okay, now that we have this language parameter, if I now go to my root layout, I can actually receive this params object here. So let's actually also type this down here. So params is going to, let's just say this is any, and I'm going to actually include a type now here. So inside of the root of our application, we're going to create a file called i18n.config.ts. This is where we're going to include all the config for our internationalization, where we actually expose what locales we want to support, what our default locale is, and a type for our locale, so we could just use it where we need to access this locale. So params is going to be an object that has a lang property, and this is of type locale. We're going to get it from this file we just created here. So let me actually copy the complete version of our root layout and explain what we're doing here. So the first change that we made is now in our root layout, because it is located inside of this dynamic route in app folder. It now has access to this params object. NextJs actually passes this params object, and because we call that folder lang, this is going to have a lang or language property on it, which is of type the locale that we just created in the I18 in the config here. The rest is what you get out of the box from NextJS. We actually also added this generate static params on top of what you get out of the NextJS script. And the reason why we did this generate static params is that now all of our pages inside this dynamic folder are going to be rendered dynamically. And if you want to instruct NextJS to build these pages statically, you can export this generate static params and actually pass in an array of objects that have this possible options of your lang or your dynamic routes for NextJS to build these pages statically. So therefore, all of these dictionaries that we're going to expose and use in our server components are going to stay on the server, but then are going to be built statically at build time and then used to just serve up static HTML when a user actually comes to our site. So this is a performance optimization for our app. Other than that, everything else is the same. The only thing I've added to our previous step where we had this providers is actually I added this header. So therefore we have a header to go between home and dashboard, and also change the locale. This is the same header that we had in the previous example. So if you have watched that video, you already know this header. The header is just rendering some links for home and dashboard, and then this local switcher, which is the toggle that we can see here, which is just toggling between the two locales that we have. Again, watch the video that we have on the channel, but basically this is just rendering different links depending on different locales that we support. Now that we have these two files, let's actually create our dictionaries here. So let me copy some code so you don't have to watch me type, because this is again very similar to what we had done in the previous example. So let me copy these dictionaries here. So inside these dictionaries, I have two JSON files, one for English. I have different scopes for navigation. For page, I have a home page, dashboard page, and then auth. These are the buttons or the text on the buttons that I have. So I'm going to include that here. Also, I'm going to create a get dictionaries function inside of my lib. So what we are doing here is exporting this get dictionary function, which is going to take in a locale and actually access that specific locale on this dictionary object I have here, and then call this function to import that specific JSON module or object for our page. So then we can actually access different scopes and the strings related to that locale. Okay, so going back to our page, if I now update the code inside of our page, let me also go to the auth button and actually bring back this auth object and the correct scopes. So let's go to our page and I'm going to explain what we're doing here. So let's close this off for a second. So inside of our page, this is our home page. Now, what I have added on top of just fetching this session to actually show this session data or the user data here, instead of hard coding our page title, I'm now using this internationalization dictionaries that we implemented. So inside of my page, I'm receiving this params object. All of your React Server components or your page components and layouts actually receive this params object. So we have access to the specific language that is in the URL. So we're going to use that lang, pass it to this get dictionaries. This is going to go and load the specific JSON or the correct JSON depending on the locale. And I'm just exporting or destructuring the page and auth scope. So just to show you what these are, in the dictionaries on these objects, you have these scopes for page navigation. So on the page, I'm getting the page that I'm on, and then the auth to actually render the correct string over here. So I have the page and the auth, and then I'm using the page home title, page home description, because I'm on the home page here. And then I'm passing this auth object down to my auth button. This is something that also people asked me to how to share this dictionaries that you're getting out of this, because this is a server component where you're actually calling a wait and fetching this dictionary. But now sometimes you may want to use them inside of a client component. So this button, because there's a button and we have click event listeners, it's a use client directive, it's a client component. So I'm passing in that specific translation or scope that it needs to it. There's different ways you can do it. Maybe you can share it via context. I find this passing down props an easier way, because we have to bring our client components as far as possible to the leaves of our component tree. So if you can render most of your pages and parts of your application with server components, you're going to benefit from your server infrastructure, data fetching easier, and streaming, and then just leave the user interactivity to the leaves of this tree where you need to actually bring in client components, and then you can pass in the specific scope or the dictionary to these components to then use the correct text or string here on the button. And let's go back, and actually now that we have another page, let's actually also create this different page that we have called dashboard, and then inside of it we're going to have a page.tsx, And again, here with a similar concept, we are again running this dashboard. We are fetching the session, we are getting the dictionary, and then accessing the dashboard page on the page scope this time. And then similarly, just showing the auth button. So let's go back to our application and refresh our app and see what's going on here. Now, as you can see, I'm getting a 404 error because right now, all of our pages are living inside of this locale folder, but there is no lang folder to render because we haven't updated our middleware. Okay, so let's replace the content of our middleware here. This is going to disable the authentication for now. We just want to bring in internationalization, and in the next step, we're going to combine them. So just at a glance to explain what we're doing here, let me just see what this is. Well, let's just install this type negotiator for a second. So I'm going to stop the dev server. Let's just pm add -d and then typeset negotiator. Let me just restart the dev server. I'll close this off. Okay, so inside of this new middleware, so we're inside of our middleware, we are exporting this middleware function that runs on every file or every route besides our static next_next folders or our API routes. So we're just excluding the API because it doesn't need internationalization. You can include it depending on where you want this to run. But it doesn't matter at this point because when we combine the two together, we actually have to run the middleware on every route and then decide inside of each middleware what we want to do depending on what path or what route the user is trying to access. The one limitation that we have is that even if we have the chain function and we're going to stack middlewares on top of each other, we cannot have two config matchers. You have to let it run for all the files, and then inside of each middleware you have access to the path name or a specific route the user is trying to access, and then decide what you want to do inside of each middleware. But here from a high level, we're just trying to see if the current path name already has a locale inside of it. And we're doing that by just looking at the locale and our supported locales inside of our own config file that we created for i18n. And then if it doesn't have a locale, we're going to just add that locale and redirect the user to the correct path. So we're just going to take it and then pass them to the correct path. So if you look at my page now, up there it shows /en because that's our default, or that's what's been detected. And then in the process of detecting what was the preferred language from the user, we're using this get locale function, which is actually using the negotiator and the match locale function we got out of the two libraries we installed to actually read the request headers and see if there is any specific or preferred language set or sent to the request. And then depending on that, and actually comparing that to the locales that we have, it's going to pick the preferred locale. And if there's nothing, it's just going to default to our default locale. So that's why we are now defaulting to the EN. Now, I've also had this question from folks to say, can we have a scenario where our default locale would be just /? So we don't have any locale if it's English. Unfortunately, with the way that I have implemented this, or with the way this was implemented, this is, by the way, an example from the documentation on NextJs on internationalization. So this is actually implementing what they have shown as a simple implementation of internationalization. And in this setup, where you have all the routes living inside of your lang folder, you would want to have that dynamic parameter, otherwise nothing would show up. And that's why we were seeing a 404 when we didn't have the middleware to actually redirect the user to the correct locale. And at the homepage, there was nothing showing because now everything lives inside of this lang folder. So in the next step, I'm going to show you how you can combine these two middleware functions to run together or run one after the other. Okay, so let me close all of these files and actually stop the dev server. I'm going to actually stash the changes we have made here. And I'm going to switch to a different branch called example. So you don't have to watch me type. Let's go pm dev. Let me close the terminal. So let's see what we're doing here. Now, the first implementation is not actually using the chain and two middleware factory functions. it's just combining the two middlewares that we had in the previous step into one file, one function. So let's see what we're doing here. So this is the get protected routes, get locale, and this is our auth middleware. So let's see what am I doing here. Now this with auth middleware is coming from the NextAuth middleware. Going back to the documentation, we saw the basic usage, but if you scroll down to the page, you can actually see another function or another middleware that you can get from the NextAuth middleware package, which allows you to pass in a specific middleware and some options rather than just this basic one, which was importing this default function. So what this allows you to do is to pass in a middleware function to this with auth wrapper, and we're going to look into that in a second, but it also allows you to pass in some options. These options have to actually repeat or be a subset of the options that you pass into the NextAuth when you initialize it. Specifically here, I'm using this authorized callback, and this is to check to see if the user is authorized by checking this token. So if this method returns true, it means that there was a token and the user is authenticated. So basically you would want to do, if there is a token, return true. If not, return false from the authorized callback, which just means that the user is not authenticated. Now, the default behavior is if the user is not authenticated, so there's no token, the authorized callback returns false. NextAuth or the middleware is going to redirect the user back to the sign-in page where they can actually sign in. And if they are logged in or if they are authorized, so this returns true, what happens is that NextAuth is going to actually call this middleware function up top. And then you can perform whatever you want it to do logic here. Now, what I've done here is to just return true from here no matter what. So whether or not the user is logged in, I'm returning true from this authorized callback function, but I'm deciding if they're logged in or not inside of my middleware. Now, how can you check that? Well, if the user is logged in, there's going to be a token property on the NextAuth object on the request. So NextAuth is going to augment the request object with some NextAuth object and token property. So you can check to see if there is a token similar to what we were doing in the authorized function to decide whether or not the user is logged in. So this is for the authentication part. So let's see what we're doing here. Just ignore this section for a second. This is for the internationalization. Let's just figure out what we're doing for the authentication part. Now, the idea is that we are running this middleware for all of our paths. I'm not exporting any config matcher from this one middleware file. And because of that, I have to decide what I want to do inside of each middleware. So for that reason, I've created this protected path array, which I can include all the paths that I want to protect behind authentication. Now, inside of our middleware, I'm calling this get protected routes function, which is going to actually access this protected path array and then pass in our locales. And the idea of this function, which I've defined up top here, is to actually mix all the locales with all the protected paths. So if the user is trying to access /dashboard or /en/dashboard or /de/dashboard, I want to create all combinations of the /dashboard so I can check to see what route they're trying to access. Now, this function is just going to map over my protected path array and also map over my locales, which is coming from our I18 config we just had. And it's going to just create this array of all the types of protected path with the locales. So I can check the path name inside my middleware with these protected ones to see whether or not this is a protected path. So I have this array of protected path with locale. And then down here, what I'm trying to do is that if there is no token, meaning that the user is not logged in, I try and see if the path name, which is coming from request.nextURL. So this is the specific path name or the route that the user is trying to access. It is accessible to you on the NextURL object of the request object. So I can see if this path name is already in my protected path and the user is not logged in. I'm going to redirect them back to the sign-in page. Now for the sign-in page, I'm using the built-in sign-in pages from NextAuth. Therefore, it leaves that API /auth/sign-in. I'm also passing a callback URL. This is going to be the URL the user was actually trying to access, so NextAuth can redirect them back to that page once they actually signed in. This is a default behavior for NextAuth. So if you're trying to access a protected page, you're not signed in, it redirects you back to the sign-in page. Once you complete the sign-in flow, it brings you back to the page that you wanted to access in the first place. So that's doing that. I'm going to show you a nicer version of actually doing that, but we're just passing in a callback URL as a query string to our URL, and then redirecting the user if they're not logged in and they're trying to access a protected path. If that's not the case, well, we're just doing what we have already seen inside the internationalization middleware, which is just checking to see if the path name already has a locale. And if it doesn't, we're just going to add it to the URL and redirect them back with that specific locale. So this example is just combining the two functionality together. This is the authentication part, this is the localization part, and it's just in one middleware exported from our middleware.ts file. So this is what I explained in the beginning. You can combine all of this logic inside one file, one function to run all together, or in the second step, as we're going to see together, we can just define them or separate them in different functions and then chain them to run one after the other. Now to see how that's done, let's actually close this, open up the terminal again, stop the dev server, and now this time we're going to switch to the fancy branch where I'm actually using the chain function. So let's pm I don't think there's any extra dependencies there, but just to make sure, let's just restart the dev server. And I'm going to explain how this one is different from the previous implementation. Let me close the terminal. So now inside of our middleware, this is the one middleware file you can export from your Next.js apps inside the root directory. I'm using the chain function. This is the function we created in the previous video. So again, if you're not familiar with this, go watch that video first. But what this chain function is responsible to do is that it takes an array of middleware factory functions and it recursively calls them or calls itself to go through all of these middlewares, calls one after the other, and then passes the request, the fetch event, and the response object down in the middleware chain or stack, so they just perform whatever logic that they want to perform. So the first step, our middleware is now changed. We have now exported a config matcher to tell Next.js that it should run this chain or this middleware function for all of our routes besides the API, Next, and whatnot. Again, a common question that I have here when folks are using the config matcher or implementing internationalization is if their images that they are hosting inside the public folder doesn't work. So you can put all of your images inside an images folder in your public folder, which is going to be hosted by Vercel. And then you can then here just exclude your images folder from where the middleware is going to run on, so you can still access all of your images without having to actually add the locale. Just a side note again, but a common question that comes up often. Now let's actually look at this middleware functions that I have created. So inside of our project now, I have this middlewares directory. I have this chain function defined. This is what we have already looked at. And now let's look at the first middleware. In the first middleware, what I'm trying to do is implementing authentication. Okay, so this is the get protected routes function, which just is going to match our array of protected paths and locales together. It's going to combine them together so we can decide if the user is trying to access a protected path. But down here, instead of using any of the middlewares returned from the NextAuth package, I'm actually writing a simple middleware that checks the token and decides whether or not the user is logged in, and depending on that, either redirects them back to the sign-in or just passes the torch down to the next middleware. How are we doing that? Well, we are calling this getToken function from NextAuth, and this is going to give us the token. You have to pass it the request object. Now the request object is now available here. And again, as a refresher, this is a middleware factory function in the sense that this is actually takes in a middleware and returns another middleware. So we're returning this function here, which is actually a middleware. And this middleware is going to receive the request and the request object and the fetch event from Next.js. Now I'm going to come back to this part in a second, but once I got the token, I'm going to add the token just like how the NextAuth middleware was augmenting our request object and adds the token to it. I'm just adding the token to this because the NextAuth is not part of the request object. There's some TypeScript errors. I just ignore them here for now. If you have a better solution to actually add this to your request type, you could go ahead and do it. I just ignored these two parts. But here I'm just augmenting my request object and adding the token to it. Again, I'm getting the path name, deciding whether or not the user is trying to access a protected path, depending on what I'm exporting here and what the actual path name of the request is. And if there is no token, well, I want to redirect them to the sign-in page, and this is the nicer version of what we have seen in the previous page, where I'm creating a new URL for my sign-in URL. The sign-in path would be API/auth/sign-in, and I'm just attaching that or combining that with the next URL because these URLs have to be absolute URLs. So you can use the next URL to actually augment this one and add that path to it. And then instead of just passing in the template literal strings to add the callback URL query string, I'm just accessing the search parameters object on this new URL and setting a callback URL to be the path name, which is the request or the path name of where the user was actually trying to access. It's a nicer version or cleaner version of writing it. And then I'm just redirecting the user to that page, which is going to finish this request response cycle if the user is not logged in and they're trying to access a protected page. So it doesn't even call this next middleware. But if that's not the case, we're going to actually call the next middleware that was passed to this function and passing down request event and response object. Now for this, I'm going to back to this part that I said, ignore for a second. In the first middleware that we are running in this chain, I am creating an instance of next response, and I want to pass this response object down, just like Express middlewares. In any middleware, you have access to request, response, and the next function. So if any of your middlewares in your stack actually manipulates the request object or the response object, you have access to those objects in your request response cycle. So I'm creating this instance just to pass it down. If any of your middlewares actually is setting headers cookies on the response, not the request, you actually have it on the client side and you don't lose that information. So this was the first middleware that is actually implementing authentication. Now, this is not your middleware that you're exporting from the Next.js, like from your root directory. This is just exporting a function or a middleware factory function. Now, the second piece of it is this middleware2 file, which is actually implementing internationalization, same exact idea that we have seen before. So instead of having this middleware now here, I've created this with I18N middleware, which is going to return a middleware that actually implements our internationalization. Again, checks to see if the path is missing a locale, and if it does, it just redirects the user to the correct locale depending on what they prefer using this get locale function and the two libraries that we installed. Okay. And then once this is done, or if the URL already had a locale, it's going to pass or call the next middleware in the chain or in the stack. Now, the way this chain function works is that once you run out of all these middlewares, the last middleware is just going to be this one. So if there is nothing, once we are increasing this index or recursively calling these middlewares, once we get to a point that there's no other functions inside this array, we're going to return this simple middleware, which is just going to return that response object we created in the first middleware to just complete this request response cycle. And with that, if I now go to the application, we should have everything working. So going back to the home page, we are now on the home page. If you're not logged in, if I now go ahead and click on the login button and use Google to log in, I should be redirected back to the home page. On the German version, I can go to the dashboard page because I'm now logged in. Sorry, my computer is a little slow. While I'm on the dashboard page, if I now sign out, the middleware kicks in. This is a protected route. I'm not signed in, so it redirects me back to the sign-in page where I can sign in again. And then this time I should be redirected back to the dashboard page because that's where I was trying to intend to access. And it would be the same thing for the English language, where you have the homepage and the dashboard. So that's a wrap for this video, folks. I know we covered a lot. This is actually combining a lot of concepts that we have learned in individual tutorials and videos, from implementing authentication to internationalizations, middleware in Next.js, and chaining them together. So I'm going to include links to all of those individual videos. If any of the stuff that we covered here is not comfortable for you, or if it is confusing, go back to those individual videos and implement them, build them together with me. There's codes. You have access to all of the source codes in GitHub for each of those projects, so you can practice them and understand what's going on first, and then come back here to combine all of them together. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.